If you grew up in the 1980s, you experienced the last decade of pre-internet optimism combined with the birth of personal technology. And psychologists are discovering that this unique combination created a generation with remarkable technological adaptability, economic resilience, and a psychological profile that bridges the gap between analog innocence and digital sophistication in ways no other generation can match. Let's talk about something that makes you different from every generation around you. If you grew up in the 1980s, roughly born between 1975 and 1985, you experienced a cultural moment that was simultaneously the peak of American optimism and the beginning of massive technological change. You're old enough to remember life before personal computers, cable TV, and video games became ubiquitous, but young enough that you adopted all of these technologies as they emerged. And research from developmental psychology reveals that this timing created a psychological profile characterized by adaptable optimism, technological fluency without dependence, and economic resilience forged through witnessing both boom and bust cycles during your formative years. Here's what makes 80s kids psychologically unique. You grew up during what economists call the Morning in America era, a time of renewed national confidence, economic growth, and cultural optimism after the malaise of the 1970s. Your childhood happened during the Reagan boom years when the prevailing message was that anything was possible, America was back, and the future was bright. Research shows that the economic and cultural atmosphere during your formative years, ages 5 to 15, creates your baseline expectations about the world. You developed during peak optimism, which gave you a fundamentally hopeful outlook that persists even when confronted with later challenges. You're not naively optimistic like some boomers, but you're also not cynically pessimistic like Gen X. You're what psychologists call resilient optimists. You believe things can improve, but you're prepared to work for it. Let's talk about the technological revolution you witnessed firsthand. You're the first generation to grow up with personal computers entering homes, but you remember life before them. You got your first Nintendo or Atari, and it changed everything, but you also remember playing outside until dark with no screens at all. You experienced the birth of MTV, cable television, VCRs, portable music players, and early video games, all during your most formative years. Studies show that people who adopt technology during childhood and adolescence develop native-level fluency, but people who had pre-technology childhoods maintain perspective that pure digital natives lack. You got both. You're technologically fluent, but not addicted. You can function fully in digital environments, but you also remember and value analog experiences. Here's the specific psychological advantage this created. You're comfortable with disruption and change because change has been your constant. You watched technology transform daily life, saw the Soviet Union collapse and the Cold War end, experienced the shift from manufacturing to service economy, and witnessed the rise of globalization, all during your developmental years. Research on adaptability shows that people who experience significant change during formative periods develop stronger change management skills than those who grow up in stable times. Your baseline isn't stability, it's evolution. This makes you remarkably adaptable to the rapid pace of modern change because your brain learned early that the world transforms constantly. Let's address the pop culture component that shaped your psychology. You're the generation that had peak Saturday morning cartoons, blockbuster movies that created cultural moments everyone shared, music videos as art form, and the birth of hip-hop culture. But you also experienced all of this before internet fragmentation. Everyone watched the same shows, knew the same songs, saw the same movies. Research shows that shared cultural experiences create strong generational identity and social cohesion. You can reference an 80s movie or song to another 80s kid and instantly connect through shared memory. Younger generations, raised in algorithmic bubbles with infinite content choices, don't have this universal cultural literacy. Your shared references aren't just nostalgia, they're social bonding tools. Here's the economic psychology piece that often goes unrecognized. You grew up during the Reagan boom of the early to mid-80s, but you also remember or witnessed the 1987 stock market crash, the late 80s recession fears, and the uncertainty of economic transitions. You saw your parents benefit from economic growth, but also felt anxiety about change. Then you entered young adulthood during the dot-com boom and bust, followed by post-9/11 recession, housing crisis, and Great Recession. Research shows this pattern of boom-bust-boom creates what economists call informed optimism. You've seen both prosperity and downturn, so you're hopeful but cautious. You're not entitled like some boomers who experienced mostly growth, and you're not catastrophically pessimistic like those who only knew hardship. You understand that economies cycle, which makes you resilient through volatility. Studies on childhood freedom reveal another defining trait of 80s kids. You had peak unsupervised childhood. You're the last generation before helicopter parenting became normalized. You rode bikes without helmets to friends' houses across town. You played in woods and built forts without adult supervision. You walked to school alone. You were latchkey kids who came home to empty houses and figured things out. Research shows that unsupervised childhood builds independence, risk assessment skills, creativity, and self-reliance. You learn to solve problems, manage boredom, and entertain yourself, skills that many younger generations struggle with because they grew up with constant structured activities and adult supervision. Let's talk about the media landscape that shaped your brain development. You're the first generation to grow up with 24-hour cable news, but you remember when news was just the evening broadcast. You experienced MTV when it actually played music videos, creating the first visual music culture. You had video games, but they were simple enough that you still spent most time outdoors. Neuroscience research shows that the media environment during childhood shapes attention patterns and information processing. You developed with moderate stimulation, more than previous generations, but far less than digital natives. This created what researchers call balanced attention. You can handle modern information overload, but you're not addicted to constant stimulation like younger cohorts. Here's the social development component. You're the last generation to develop social skills entirely through face-to-face interaction. You asked people out in person or on landline phones. You had to navigate social hierarchies without social media feedback. You made plans and kept them because there was no way to cancel via text. You dealt with conflict directly because you couldn't hide behind screens. Research shows that developing social skills through direct interaction builds confidence, communication abilities, and emotional intelligence that text-based socialization doesn't provide. You can function in both analog and digital social environments because you learned the fundamentals in analog before digital existed. Let's address the specific cultural messages you absorbed. The 80s celebrated individual achievement, entrepreneurship, success, and self-improvement. You grew up with, greed is good, just do it, and be all you can be. You watched movies about underdogs succeeding through determination. You absorbed messages about personal responsibility and meritocracy. While these messages have legitimate critiques, they also instilled what psychologists call internal locus of control, the belief that your actions determine your outcomes. Research shows people with internal locus of control have better mental health, higher achievement, and greater resilience than those who feel controlled by external forces. The 80s gave you agency. Here's the family structure component. You grew up during the peak of divorce rates and dual-income households. Many 80s kids experienced family instability, parental absence due to work, or blended families. But research shows this also built resilience. You learn to adapt to changing family structures, become self-sufficient young, and develop emotional independence. You're not damaged by this, you're strengthened. Studies show that moderate childhood adversity, not trauma, but challenge, builds coping skills that serve you throughout life. You learned that families change, people adapt, and you survive. Research on nostalgia reveals that 80s nostalgia is particularly strong and commercially viable because your generation had such distinct, shared cultural markers. The 80s aesthetic, neon colors, specific music, iconic movies, unique fashion, was so visually and culturally distinctive that it's instantly recognizable. When you feel nostalgic for the 80s, you're not romanticizing a perfect past. You're remembering a time when life felt simpler, possibilities felt endless, and the future looked bright. Psychologists note this is hopeful nostalgia, longing for the optimism of that era, not denial of its problems. Let's talk about the work ethic you developed. You came of age during the work hard, play hard 80s. You absorbed messages about ambition, success, and climbing the ladder. But you also entered the workforce during massive economic restructuring. You've experienced corporate loyalty meaning nothing, seen automation eliminate jobs, and navigated multiple recessions. This created what organizational psychologists call pragmatic ambition. You're driven and goal-oriented, but you're not naively loyal to employers. You work hard, but you also protect yourself. This balance serves you well in modern, unstable employment markets. Here's the authenticity piece. You grew up before social media created performance culture. You could have private lives, make mistakes without documentation, and develop identity without public curation. You took photos, but they stayed in albums, not online. You had embarrassing phases that stayed private. Research shows that identity formation benefits from privacy and experimentation. You got to try on different selves without permanent record. This allowed for authentic self-discovery that's nearly impossible when every phase is documented and posted. Your identity is solid because it was built privately. Studies show that 80s kids have specific strengths. You're highly adaptable to technological change, you're optimistic but realistic about outcomes, you're comfortable with ambiguity and disruption, you have strong work ethic tempered by healthy boundaries, and you maintain both digital fluency and analog appreciation. These traits position you well for modern challenges that require both innovation and stability, hope and realism, change navigation, and tradition maintenance. The truth about growing up in the 1980s is this. You experienced a unique cultural window when American optimism peaked. Technology emerged but didn't dominate. Childhood freedom was maximum before safety culture took over, and economic growth created hope that your generation internalized. This timing created a psychological profile that's both nostalgic for simpler times and fully capable in complex modern environments. You bridge the analog and digital, the optimistic and realistic, the independent and connected. So if you grew up in the 1980s, you're not stuck in the past when you reference that era. You're honoring a formative experience that gave you unshakable optimism, technological adaptability, and resilience through change. You got the last of childhood freedom and the first of digital fluency. You're not living backwards. You're carrying forward the best of both worlds. Keep being optimistically resilient. The 80s made you that way. Comment your birth year if you're an 80s kid and name one thing from the 1980s that younger generations think is vintage, but you remember as normal life. Let's see who remembers VHS rewinders and MTV actually playing music.